Chapter 3 The Experimentalists, Part 2 Experimental Dueling. Now, what about microbes? Even if all normal life comes from eggs or seeds or parents, surely the same does not apply to the weird, tiny, rudimentary aliens in the microscope. Insects have heads and legs and wings, and maybe we can count them as complex higher organisms. But surely the tiniest, crudest forms of life are brewed up wherever there is a fertile infusion for them to swim in? We never see microbes lay eggs or give birth like normal animals. They simply appear or they don't. So, are microscopic life forms cooked up spontaneously or not? Again, only careful observation and experimentation could tell us for sure. Leeuwenhoek had performed an experiment or two with his little animals, and he was reluctant to believe in spontaneous generation even for microbes, but he was an explorer in uncharted realm, and like Reddy, he was admirably cautious about jumping to conclusions. Not everyone was so cautious. In 1748, an English Roman Catholic priest by the name of John Turberville Needham read about animalcules. He wanted to see if they could appear from nothing, so he took a trip to his kitchen. He cooked some gravy over a fire for a few minutes to kill any microbes that might be there, poured it into a bottle, corked it, and waited. After a few days, he opened the container, placed some of the contents under the microscope, and saw animalcules. He had offered nature a nurturing medium, and nature had brewed up a fresh crop of microbes inside. About 2 decades later, an Italian Roman Catholic priest by the name of Lazzaro Spallanzani caught wind of Needham's experiment, and he smelled something fishy. Spallanzani knew about Reddy's work, and he admired Reddy's carefulness and experimental technique. In contrast, Needham's work sounded sloppy. Had Needham cooked the gravy long enough? Had he adequately sealed the container? Microbes are pretty tiny. Maybe they had found a way to sneak through the cracks around the cork. Spallanzani conducted his own set of tests, this time with a variety of sealing methods and a variety of cooking times as comparisons and controls. Spallanzani picked up the tradition that Galileo had started and Redi had built upon, and he continued their pursuit of truth through the experience and experiment. In some tests, Spallanzani poured the gravy into a glass flask with a thin neck, and then he used a flame to melt the neck, fusing the glass itself over the opening and making a truly impermeable airtight container. These impermeable flasks he boiled for an hour, and then he allowed them to stand for several days. When he broke them open and examined the contents, he found nothing but sterile gravy. Nature had not been able to form any microbes in those perfectly sealed containers. In another series of tests, he simply popped a cork into the mouth of the flask. He boiled these for an hour also to ensure they were sterile to begin with, then waited. This time the gravy teemed with life. Needham had apparently been sloppy and allowed microbes to sneak in around the cork. In further testing, Spallanzani sealed the flasks by fusing the glass, but then he only boiled the flask for a few minutes as Needham had done. After examining these flasks, he also found microbes. Spallanzani had discovered that some microbes can survive brief boiling. Needham had performed a single casual test and had come to the wrong conclusion. Spallanzani, using careful comparisons and controls, showed that if you really seal and sterilize a flask, then no microbes can appear inside until the seal is broken. Needham did not take Spallanzani's rebuttal lying down. Needham was friends with Georges Buffon, the philosopher of the force, and together they tried to explain Spallanzani's results their way. For Needham and Buffon, life did not form truly spontaneously, but under the influence of an invisible force that flows through matter and assembles the building blocks into simple living things. Spallanzani had boiled his flask for an hour instead of only a few minutes, and this must have somehow destroyed the force in the gravy. In other words, the excessive boiling must have destroyed the ability of the gravy to generate life. They did at least take the time to repeat some of Spallanzani's experiments, and they also noticed that when they broke the necks of the flask, there was a hiss of air as it rushed in to fill the vacuum in the flask. The flame used to fuse the glass was also heated and expanded the air inside, which left a partial vacuum inside the flask when it cooled back down again. For Buffon and Needham, this hissing was evidence that the air had been damaged or destroyed by the flame during the sealing process, and that the capacity for generating life had been damaged. Spallanzani had much less to fear from authority than his fellow Italians of a century earlier. He didn't need to worry about being punished for saying things that other people disagreed with. That didn't mean that the road to clear understanding was now easy. More and more people, both careful people and sloppy people, were opening up with their opinions, and conflict and error were still dangers. Even the Royal Society was impressed with Buffon's theory of the origin of living things. But as long as observation and experiment, evidence and proof, were taken as the ultimate judge, then errors could be corrected, conflicts could be resolved, and truth could win. Needham had reported the results of his initial casual experiment, and Spallanzani had given him his more thorough rebuttal. Now Needham and Buffon had tipped the ball back into Spallanzani's court. Spallanzani spiked it. As before, he did not reply with speculation, but with thorough and careful experiments. Buffon and Needham had not bothered to wait and to see what happened to the broth after exposing it to fresh air. Spallanzani did. He left his broth to sit in his broken flasks, but now newly exposed to air. The broth that had formerly been sterile soon filled with microbes, showing that it had not lost the ability to support life after all. As long as the flasks remained unbroken, no microbes ever appeared inside. But whenever he broke the flasks and exposed the contents, they filled with microbes shortly thereafter. It was exposure to the outside world that made the difference, not damage to the broth. Spallanzani also invented a way to seal the flasks without creating a vacuum. With these flasks, there was no inrush of air when the necks were broken, yet they still remained sterile as long as the necks were unbroken. It was the seal. Scientists and philosophers have always criticized and commented on the work of earlier scientists and philosophers. It can be very helpful to summarize and analyze what has been done by people before you attempt to go further. And sometimes dueling with your contemporaries can also be useful. If I had been Francesco Redi or Lorenzo Spallanzani, I would probably have been annoyed and frustrated at having to debunk Athanasius Kircher or John Turberville Needham, and yet my own arguments might have grown stronger by it. As long as your opponents are at least partially devoted to finding truth, having to answer their objections can make your own case stronger. To this day, peer review, in which scientists give feedback on each other's work, is an important component of self-correcting mechanism of scientific discovery. It can be very effective when everyone involved is diligent, thorough, and respectful, and it can be invaluable for ironing out details. It also runs the risk of becoming personal, contentious, and wasteful at times. Where do microbes come from? If microbes cannot appear out of nothing, then where do they come from? When you see two normal animals stuck together, they're probably mating. Sometimes you see two microbes stuck together. Are they mating? Spallanzani didn't immediately investigate this question himself. He was a busy man with diverse scientific interests. His puzzle found its way to a fellow Renaissance man in nearby Geneva. Horace Benedict de Saussure attempted to corral some microbes in an infusion of hemp seed so that he could watch them closely, and he eventually came to the opposite conclusion. Each doublet was not two animals coming together, but one animal splitting apart. Microbes seem to have their own way of doing things in every area of life: eating, moving around, and reproducing. perhaps their unique way of reproducing is not by laying eggs or giving birth, but simply by splitting into two halves. Or maybe splitting is just a rare accident. Maybe every once in a while, one of the speedy microbes comes zooming along without watching where it's going and smacks into another one and breaks into two pieces. That was the idea of John Ellis, who repeated de Saussure's experiments and observed that only a small percentage of microbes divide. He also insisted that the normal way for microbes to reproduce was by giving birth, because he claimed to have seen children microbes inside parent microbes, and even grandchildren microbes inside the children microbes. Spallanzani heard about de Saussure's observations and about Ellis's theory, and again, something smelled fishy. He decided to return from his other pursuits to focus his attention back onto microbes. And he showed once more what thorough, careful experimentation can do. He placed a droplet of infusion bustling with microbes onto a piece of glass, next to a droplet of pure water. With a delicate probe, he teased out a fine bridge of water connecting the two droplets, then carefully watched and waited. Eventually, a rambling microbe wandered across the bridge. Spallanzani quickly wiped away the thin bridge of water, trapping the microbe in a pond of it by itself. Spallanzani had invented a way to isolate a single microbe. He watched this loner carefully and eventually saw it split into two. Then he watched the pieces split again. He repeated this experiment and watched the division many times. For microbes, this is not a rare event caused by accident. Reproduction by division is routine procedure. Where do new microbes come from? That question now had an observable answer, a demonstrable alternative to spontaneous generation. At least sometimes they can multiply by splitting themselves, but there was still the question of where the parent microbes come from, and it had not been proven that microbes cannot self-assemble. Maybe they can generate in more than one way. After Spallanzani, the debate over spontaneous generation would flare up one final time before being laid to rest more or less permanently by an intellectual great-grandchild of Galileo. The intellectual tradition. I think you can argue that there is one living thing that is spontaneously generated, and that is an idea. Ideas and philosophies grow and evolve from their predecessors like any living thing. But every original idea has to appear for the first time somewhere. It has to be born in the mind of a creative thinker by an act of will. There is some kind of living force capable of assembling prior elements into new and unique creations. That force is human concentration. Human thinking is what assembles observations and prior ideas into new ideas. The knowledge of humanity grows by addition, each new thought being created and integrated at some place in the world and some point in history by the effort of one mind. I am not a historian, and I don't know how much credit to give to Renaissance thinkers prior to Galileo. But when recognizing giants of originality, Galileo must be in the first rank. In this one man has born a philosophy that you should look with your own eyes, put two and two together with your own mind, and test the assertions of authority by your own experiences and experiments. And this intellectual bonfire ignited chains of sparks that can be traced through all subsequent intellectual history. In biology, Galileo ignited a tradition that passed to Francesco Redi, the mythbuster who invented the controlled experiment, and then to Spallanzani, the man who cleaned up other people's messes and showed us where new microbes come from. The illuminating torch of careful observation and experimentation passed from Galileo to Redi to Spallanzani, and then it passed across the Alps from Italy to France. It passed to a successor who gratefully hung Spallanzani's portrait on his wall, improved Spallanzani's experiments, and showed how microbes move the world. This man gave us the first germ theory of disease, thoroughly backed by evidence. He also delivered the final coup de grace to the theory of spontaneous generation of microbes and convinced the world that it is possible to defend ourselves against them. And then he gave us the weapons with which